Hello, everybody. Adam Parks here with another episode of the AI Hub. Today, I'm here with a gentleman that has such a broad breadth of knowledge around both the legal and a great understanding of the technical. Mr. Nabil Foster with the Barron Newburger firm. How you doing today, Nabil?
I'm doing great, Adam. Thank you so much. And your introductions always make me blush just a little bit. You just you should write my taglines for my LinkedIn stuff. I'd get a lot more posts or a lot more reactions.
That's always on the table. I really do appreciate you coming on and having a chat with me today because I think AI is such an important part of where our industry is headed and understanding the regulatory framework around that, some of the privacy rules and the mishmash of things that we need to really be aware of as we start to leverage artificial intelligence across the industry. But before we jump into our conversation today, just a quick word from our sponsor, Latitude by Genesis.
Transform your collections process with Latitude by Genesis, a powerful cloud-based solution designed to manage debt collection and be the answer to all of your accounts receivables challenges. Latitude simplifies operations with features like workflow process automation, customizable agent tools, and seamless integrations for AI tools scoring, data scoring, written and voice communications, compliance, and negotiations. Plus, it does all the things you expect from your debt collection software. Whether you're a creditor, debt buyer, or third-party agency, Latitude helps boost recovery rates and streamline operations. Discover smarter collections today.
All right, Nabil, thank you so much for coming on and having a chat with me today. For anyone who's not been as lucky as me to get to know you through the years, can you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and how you got to the seat you're in today?
Boy, okay, what about myself? All right, I've been doing this for a minute, as they say in the South. So I came out of law school in 2000. So worked for a judge and worked for a few different firms, and really came into this space back in like 2007. And so, yeah, I've been in the space since then. And the arm industry has certainly gone through some changes, and has been some growth spurts and some contractions, and we've had a few cases that have sort of upset the whole industry, and then overturned the apple cart, and then we start to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. It's what I am. Yeah, so I do this litigation stuff. I'm pretty good at it. I like it. I teach at a law school. I teach trial advocacy and legal ethics. So how to get to the seat I am now? Well, being friendly with people in the industry and doing some good work, and then a little bit of luck that always comes into the factor of everyone's life. So sorry, that may not be the best answer, but
No, that's great. Opportunity is the intersection of both luck and preparedness. And so I think having the experience coming back to 2007 and living through some of the economic cycles that this industry has gone through, I think provides you with some insights to where it's going as well, because we can never predict where we're going unless we can understand where we've been. And that's where I think this conversation starts to get really interesting as we look at artificial intelligence. Can you help me understand kind of the lay of the land as it relates to artificial intelligence in the debt collection space from a like how are the regulators and the legislators ultimately looking at us when we're looking through an AI lens?
well, that's a very good question, because that's not apparent from most of the discussion that you see about AI, because most of the discussion about AI in the press it's from an investor standpoint, valuation of this company, the price of a particular stock of a company that makes chips for AI, and energy plants, blah blah blah. There's all this buzz around it, but when it starts to get a little more focus into the application of AI into a heavily regulated industry, the perspective changes a great deal. And I'll just say it becomes a bit darker. It's read the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal. It's blue sky's the limit on these things. But remember, that's out in the consumer space, right? It's, and for the US economy, the consumer space is the biggest sector of our economy, right? Consumer spending on stuff like that's what drives this engine for the most part. I think it's like 70%, something like that. And so therefore, AI, as it's implemented on, use in from people's, social media things, or, they're using it to write term papers, or they're, using it in inside companies to create content for annual reports, what have you. Like, this is all, that's all sort of what I consider in the law broad perspective, like consumer facing. It's like, okay, or consumer market.
Mm-hmm.
I got to be careful how to use the word consumer in our context. It means something very special and very specific. So I don't want people to get confused. When you talk about regulators, they start looking at this with a far more jaundiced eye, a far more skeptical eye regarding, well, what are you using? What are you using this for? How's it going to? They're asking use case scenarios because they want to know, okay, how does this get rolled out? What does it look like? What is the consumer, in the sense that our industry understands it? What is the consumer faced with? What are the choices? What are the options? So it's a far more sort of detailed run of show regarding the implementation of that when it's consumer facing. Now, if you're using, and that's for the most part, what I call things on what's called the front of house. Anyone who's worked in a restaurant knows about front of house, back of house, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the same analogy works here. Those regulators, they focus much more on the front of house, right? And so things that people are putting up a, AI chatbot to actually communicate with consumers about their debts, whatever, that's going to get a lot of scrutiny. And you got to have answers for all of that for them to be satisfied. Otherwise, they don't understand how this is happening or the risk involved. They're more likely to be skeptical of it, and you can run into problems. I'll stop there.
No, I mean, look, they always talk about the black box and the challenges of the black box itself, and what does that ultimately mean? Information going in, information coming, your inputs, your outputs, and how is that being processed within the black box? And I feel like early on that was really the case. A lot of the tools that were out there, you put some data in, something came out the other side. And from a scoring model perspective, we'll use, account segmentation as an example of a use case. That can run you into some trouble. And we can look at the Goldman Sachs instance when Goldman Sachs started issuing the Apple Card, and they were issuing different credit limits to different people based on sex, right? So gender was a driving factor in their model for some reason. Now, as I've started to look at it, the black box feels like it's starting to dissipate because everybody realizes that you have to be able to understand what's happening within the model and explain it. Because if you can't explain it, you can't use it. But it becomes a question of using account characteristics to drive treatment and decisions versus behaviors to drive treatments and decisions, and kind of the differentiation between those two worlds. Any insights on what you've seen or experienced between those two worlds, groups that have been using, let's say, the raw math versus the behavior, looking at those account characteristics? Because you can't really break it down and treat them differently based on zip code. You're going to run into redlining and other issues.
That's correct. Using things that because if you look at it as like a straight math problem, you're like, what's the objective data that you have? Though you're right, those are the things that are easily understood if you're doing things by zip code, right? Or do things by gender, right? Like, those sort of hard data points that can get you into trouble because it says like, oh, if that practice a singular data point, but now if you got a couple data points and that can be pieced together into somewhat of an image of, well, you are targeting certain populations over others, you're giving different rate. That's where you're going to get into the inquiries because if you will, that's the smoke, right? That's the smell. That's the hint of the smell of smoke that draws the regulators. And they're like, oh, is there a fire here, right? And nobody wants to be the subject of a fire inquiry from a regulator because if they think they smell smoke, imagination can be type of thing that, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, I smelled smoke. There must have been something burning. It may not be burning right now, but something was burning. So we're going to keep looking until we find where the traces of the fire were.
That's it.
You're stuck in a CID for hundreds of $1,000s out the door on lawyers like me or other people like trying to patch up the dike or try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. It's better just to avoid it. And go back to your question. It's the behavioral that probably has the most practical use case, and the one that's more individualized, so therefore a little bit less subject to the type of scrutiny of class treatment. And I use that word as a play on the word because you want to avoid class actions, right? And how do you get class actions? You have a uniform way of treating or doing something across the board. And if the way you're doing that violates one of these statutes, whether federal or state, which guess what, people? We're going to see a lot more state regulators stepping into this, and you're going to get a hodgepodge mix of restrictions regarding data privacy, what have you. And I think you and I talked a long time ago. It's like it's not too far off where everyone's going to be considered a data broker regarding just the information they have.
Based on the rules they were trying to pass, literally everybody on the planet with a contact list on their phone is a data broker.
Yeah. It becomes absurd of like the definition. They write them so broad because they're trying to cover. They have in their minds, the legislature, they have in their mind certain things that they want to cover, and then they want to make it just a little bit broader in case they cover something they couldn't think of. They don't bother to think about all the other stuff they're just sucking up with that same definition, and it's like it becomes absurd.
It's the unintended consequences of their actions, and there's unintended consequences, and the challenge for me is that a lot of them, it's not that they don't understand, it's that they don't care to understand. And that becomes the challenge when we talk about, especially at a state level, it's not as well thought out, right? You're not dealing with the same caliber of education, you're not dealing with the same caliber of experience, of business experience, as you are potentially at a federal level, because some of these states are wild, for lack of better terminology. It's hard. So talk to me a little bit about that change. We see the CFPB, I don't want to say shutting down because I don't see that as ever being a reality, but they've, let's say, taken a step out.
It's shrinking right now. So
they've taken a step out of the forefront.
Yeah, they take a step back. And one of those laws of nature is that nature abhors a vacuum, right? So the space that the CFPB was filling, occupying most of the field, as that retracts, that creates, guess what, a vacuum. And what gets sucked into there? It's, choose your usual suspects of AGs or others, other state regulators wanting to step in where they think that if there's a lane, they're probably going to go down that. And we're in an ever increasing environment of testing of boundaries, shall we say. And what we find in the regulatory space is probably going to be the same sort of testing of boundaries, because if the CFPB is not occupying the space, then others are going to step up and step into it in their little corner of where they have their jurisdiction, right? And there lies the problem. It's like, well, the way they make rice in Georgia's is kind of different how they make rice in Seattle, in Washington State. I'm like, okay, well, each way they say, well, this is how we do it here, and you're sort of subject to.
It was an impossibility to manage your business. Because now you've got all of this mix and match, and then on top of that, you've got, let's say, the plaintiff's bar basically coming in and trying to create new rules in the absence of the CFPB through litigation. And I think we're going to see that step up as well.
Yes, that will step up. Although I haven't seen the real uptick in the plaintiff's bar, because of the amount of chaos that's there. It hasn't settled down as exactly where, they want to really start to lean in, right? It's. And I don't know if we're ever going to see another, remember Hunstein and that whole debacle, right? Like I think it started in the 11th Circuit, right? And then it just rippled out. And it's like, okay, so, there's a trickle of that now. For those of you who remember, it was, for a time period, it seemed like every case being filed had a Hunstein claim in it. And we won't tell people what it is because it's fading into the past. So we'll just leave it there. Just let it fade into the past.
Belongs.
Where it belongs, exactly. So there'll probably be something else that will come up, but it may not be that sweeping, show up in certain markets, in certain areas where you have interaction with state legislation, dealing with data, dealing with our requirements. It also comes back to, as more and more AI is adopted into systems that people are using, because it's getting back to the front of house, back of house operations, right? The front of house is easy to say, oh, well, be cautious about this, because if you have a chatbot answering a consumer's questions about how much their debt is, right, and what's what's the amount of debt without the fees, and then the chatbot says, tries to do a calculation, and they come up, and that chatbot hallucinates and comes up with some sort of number that's not based in reality. in a heavily regulated industry, all right, you've just walked yourself into either a regulatory complaint or a lawsuit, because now instead of the consumer being told he owes $150, it's now it's $15,000. I'm just it's like, how did that happen? They take a screenshot. They're like, okay, that's enough for a complaint, and now you're left explaining that. So the hallucination stuff aside, which still is a bit of a mystery and a problem, is what I would call the supply chain security in AI implementation. And that's where, to get to your point about regulators, I think that's where they're most likely going to focus on trying to ratchet down on, well, do you know how secure you're using this particular product or this type of technology in your, say, back of house operations to do modeling, what have you? You're using AI, you're using something, and how confident are you that AI system is A, secure, B, doesn't have vulnerabilities, and that becomes difficult because the people in our industry, they're not software engineers, they're buying products. And as an example of this, I'll take it back to, remember, some of you may remember back in 2017, there's a huge data breach of, I think it was Equifax. They didn't apply a patch from an Apache software systems. There's some vulnerability. They came out, they created a patch, and then just the system engineers at Equifax, I think it was Equifax, they didn't apply that patch. That led to a data breach that happened over a period of like 70 days or so, in which 148 million people's information was exposed. That's half the U.S. population, right? It was so big. There was even 2018. There's like a congressional, hearing on it. It's 75 pages of rambling on of like, wherefore, just collecting
what about
data.
the application stack there too, right? So you've got, not only are you giving it to your vendor, but what LLMs is your vendor using? So you may have fourth, fifth, sixth party disclosures depending on how deep that application stack runs.
That's exactly right. And the whole point of what people don't realize is that this AI stuff, whether it's, a lot of it seems to be pivoting in the industry towards open source. That's what, DeepSeek. DeepSeek, which is came out of nowhere back 2 years ago. The Chinese-based LLM model came out of nowhere, and it runs
with no borders,
a fraction of the resources that OpenAI requires, right? And it's all open source, which means, what does open source mean? It means you get to see the code that's actually running this thing, and it's like, well, how is that? Well, the idea of open source, people like that idea because, oh, you can see what's in there. Well, yes and no. You can see what's in there, but you have to take the time and you have to have the knowledge to know what you're looking at. If you don't do that, then you can open source, you become vulnerable to what you might call like packet attacks. And that's not the right word, but basically how all these open source software products, its architecture is designed for people to look at and then create little packets or little packages of additional code to help modify and improve the operations of, if you will, so the base programming. The problem is that those packets are where people can insert malicious code, and if you don't get it from a good source, or somebody maliciously replaces the packet on a source, and you download that and install it, you now have it's the equivalent of the phishing attack, where people say, don't click on links of documents that someone sent you that you don't know. You now have a problem. Now, if you have an IT person somewhere in your supply chain, and they're like, oh, well, let's get that packet. And they go to one packet distribution hub, and like, oh, that server's too busy. Well, I'll just go to the secondary one, and they grab one from there because these libraries are all over the place. They just inserted this this poison packet, literally, and now that's the weakest link. So the whole chain now is compromised because now there's malicious code that's been inserted on that third party vendor down the way, and it's now, they got a backdoor into the system and so forth and so on. And that's where I'm saying I think the regulators are probably going to focus a bit more attention on. And I don't see anybody who has a real solution for that, because it requires organization, coordination. but in a way that doesn't start to trigger people saying that this there's some sort of industry collusion there, like anti-competitive practices and so forth and so on. It's like, look, we just want to make sure we don't get a poison packet installed in this open software. Anyway, I'm going on too long.
No, I think you make a really good point. It actually leads me to another question. As we think about the way that, let's say, consumer attorneys have created these scripts for consumers to call in and try and trap collectors into saying the wrong thing. So when they start figuring out, or they start getting a little bit more complex, aren't they going to try and do the same thing with the AI? Like if they realize that there's, let's say, a hallucinated response to a particular question, that they're just going to try and get a whole bunch of consumers together to submit that same question and start to create this storyline that they can bring to the court. I mean, it's a manufactured storyline, but I would expect them to do the same thing. They're manufacturing the storyline on the phone. Why would they not do the same thing through an AI toolset?
And actually, the AI tool site is probably easier for them to do that because it's all typed out. It's not a recording. You have the chat on the screen and they just, copy paste, and that's exhibit one to the complaint. So I think your sense of caution regarding the vulnerability to manipulation is real. And that's another reason why there are all these sort of, cautionary tales about, well, my personal opinion, I don't think any of the AI is ready for consumer facing, direct communications. I think the risk, and when we talk about hallucination, that goes back to the black box. There was a study done last year in June of 2024. It was the first systematic study done. It was at Stanford. It's their called the Reg Lab or the Human AI Center for something or other. You can, if you Google it, you'll find it.
We'll go find it.
2024 study. And they found that, and they focused on using the publicly available, so ChatGPT or the ones that are publicly available. And they use that to focus on legal issues, right? Trying to use it for implementation in the law. So this factors more into, my wheelhouse of legal ethics, teaching that to lawyers and the risk to lawyers of using these chatbots to write legal briefs or do things. It found that those LLMs hallucinated at least 58% of the time, that they struggled to identify their own hallucinations and often uncritically accepted incorrect legal assumptions and the cues, right? So basically they're saying there's no quality check. The old adage, garbage in, garbage out, is what they're saying when it comes to the law. Now, why this is interesting is because we often think that, well, we have all this legal reasoning. We have all these legal opinions. We have all this clarity. We have all this, lawyers charged by the word, and they just go on and on and on. And you would think that could correlate to some sort of mathematical probability that these chatbots or these LLM could figure out and use. Well, apparently not. It's either the inputs are just bad, or there's still a whole lot more of the hallucination stuff that they don't understand in the neural network of the training and the weighting, as some people may not know. So when you have an AI model like the ChatGPT or DeepSeek, whatever, that's a model, and they come up with different models. Models consist of the actual programming code. Then there's the training of that sort of code model, and then there's the weighting. And what does that mean? Training is the actual data set that you try to have a curated data set to sort of help these algorithms and this code start to make the appropriate associations between particular data points. And they start to see that. And then how do you help it? Because otherwise it's just going to run randomly. You use the weighting as a way of trying to say, no, these two, there's a closer relationship between these two data points than these two data points. Perfect example. You ask AI engine to be able to look at a photograph and count how many cats versus how many dogs are in the photograph, right? Well, you and I were like, well, I know what a cat is, dog is, right? But to the AI model, it has no idea. Both of these creatures have 4 legs, they got fur, they got ears, they got, some have big tails, small tails, right? But there's a combination of these data points of this close association that focus on the characteristics of cats versus characteristics of dogs, right? And different sizes. We're able to adjust that because the way our brains work. These models, you got to use weighting to help it sort of figure out that it starts to understand or recognizes the shape of furry ears and a furry tail. Okay, that in connection with some other things means it's more probably a cat versus a dog. But then you need to look at some other things, and that's the weighting part. And that's where the regulators also probably are going to, I don't think regulators are going to be able to focus or understand what the coding is or the training, but the weighting, they probably will focus on that, because the weighting is how, that's the user input from the humans regarding this is what we think is the right answer. So we're going to adjust these levers so that the model here produces this result more often than the wrong, what we think is the correct result. Now, the problem is that the intentions are sometimes on, very specific use cases. The unintended consequences of how things are being weighted, that's where, you don't know where it's going to come out. And to your point, Adam, is, like, it's go back to the Golden Sachs. It's like, there probably wasn't anyone who said, we're going to use gender as a way that's going to really be a determining factor for how, rates of interest or, credit extension is going to function. But that data point or that weighting towards one or the other, like, there probably is some association with other data points that that model said, like, okay, well, we are being told to weight towards, this characteristic or this thing, and that has association more with this gender as opposed to that gender. And so therefore the model learns, says, well, this one's more, we're going to weight this one more. I wasn't there, I didn't program it, but that's the type of thing that,
if it's trained on the bias of human decision making, so if there were humans making that decision and this model was trained based on those bias, then that AI model is also going to have that bias. But I also want to go back to the hallucination for a minute, because this is one of those really interesting things for me, and it's been my experience. If I ask it to write a whole brief, I'm going to get trash as a result, because these models are not great at doing long form anything. It's just not built for that purpose. But if I think about it and I send out small pieces and I have it write paragraphs at a time, I get much better results from it. And I think that's something that we don't really look at all that much when we're looking at the products or evaluating products. And I think that's going to become, the result of that is going to become very important over time. We're responsible for the output of any model that we're using. So if I'm going to use it to write I'm not a lawyer, but if I was to use it to write a legal brief, I'm still responsible for everything in that brief, as the courts have held through the the issues that have come up over the past couple of years, false citations and all of that, citing cases that don't exist, all of those types of things. And when you start asking it to do some math, you really do always have to ask it a lot of questions about how it got there. And I want to be all fourth grade about it, but show your work.
It really is. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. It's show your work. It's like, I was thinking about this the other day when I'm like, it's, we all have tests, and like, go through school and there's a workspace, and it's like, okay, you get, teachers are looking for, did you get the right answer? But they're also looking to see, did you identify your work? How did you get to the answer? Because especially multiple choice questions, like, they want to know the work, not just that you got the right answer, although that's also important, but how you got through the work tells the teacher something. So that is absolutely correct. And I think your point about writing a whole brief, it's, as these tools become more sophisticated, it's going to require better human judgment about where they're deployed and the specific use cases. Like the idea that just, AI is like, miracle salve. You just put it on there and, just stuff happens. That's not going to work. AI is not really going to be, for a lot of people in our industry, AI is not going to be a real replacement for full-time equivalents, but there can be tools that can help your full-time equivalents do their jobs better, because they're, instead of having, for example, let's say you have on the, back of house, you have modeling, you have a thing, and you help your frontline collectors, people who are making the phone calls or responding to emails. Although from a security standpoint, I would suggest, there's a lot of security people talk about, don't have open email accounts where people are sending stuff or receiving stuff, because there's a lot of open vectors to be attacked and get infected. So I'll just say that some people use email. I think it's an unnecessary risk, because you've got You got a lot of people who just might cycle through your organization. They don't really care. And they're like, yeah, sure. Well, I wouldn't do this on my home computer, but sure. My work has good security, so I can click on these links and not worry about it, right? And then your system's infected. But my point is that they're tools that can make those people more effective or more efficient at their jobs. And they're never going to replace them entirely, but they can help them do their jobs better because it's a tool. But it comes down to human judgment of like, well, where's a good place to implement this tool? It's like you look at a tool chest and you're like, okay, I got a chisel, I got a crowbar, and I got a screwdriver, right? Which is the best tool for what I want to do? Now that's really a human judgment issue. And that is something AI is never going to be able to replace. The human judgment, never going to be able to replace. The ability, the human capacity to take a pause and to question yourself, to say, am I doing this right? That's something that only humans really possess. It goes back to the old adage, you may have heard this, that anybody who's done a little woodworking, it's like measure twice, cut once, right? Measure twice, cut once. Well, what does that really mean? It means, okay, you think you know what the dimensions are for your table, and you measure it. You measure it all out. You're like, okay. Now, before you actually start cutting wood, you're like, all right, let me sort of go back to basics. Let's just start. Let me get the tape measure out. Let me make sure I measured this correctly, right? And you're doing a verification. And now the process of us going through that, you would say that a machine can measure it again, but the problem with the AI measures is that they perform the functions in exactly the same function. It's the order of operations, as you talk with mathematics. They'll do it the same way. It really is the human capacity to say, oh, I've measured this before I implement, before I cut. Let me just make myself feel certain that I got these measurements right. And then as you go through it again, it takes a little time. It's where you find, oh, wait, I was off by a quarter inch here. Okay. User error or, what have you, like better you should do that then, and you get it right. AI doesn't have the capacity to catch its own mistakes. Even if you ask it again, like write a paragraph about this, summarize these facts, right? And then you ask it like, did you make any errors? And in this thing, and the AI will always like, nope, everything's correct. And like, it's like, that's where
it's all about how you ask that second question. It's all about how you ask that second question, and are you using the same model to watch your model? So asking the model that just spit something out, is this accurate, is one thing. Asking another model if that was accurate,
that's correct,
may be something else, but that's starting to get rather complex. And now, as we talked about that application stack and all of the things that come along with, a third, fourth, fifth, sixth piece of software in that stack, I think ultimately creates some new challenges. And we look at the use cases across the debt collection industry, and I think there's some use cases that are going to catch fire faster than others because they're safer plays. And behavioral scoring, understanding mass data sets, and just trying to understand the behaviors of different segments of consumers based on the actions that they've taken. And when I say actions, I'm opening an email, opening a text message, clicking on something, going through and authenticating themselves. I truly believe that the debt collection industry will become mostly an e-commerce business in the next 10 years. What is that ultimately going to mean in terms of trying to understand it? So as I continue to make that statement, and some people give me the weird look and other people go, yeah, it really is going in that direction. I think there's a lot of us that are still pushing back against that theory. However, in trying to prepare for it in my own mind, I've started looking at massive amounts of behavioral information from websites to better understand how the consumers are using it, how the websites need to change in order for consumers to do that, and looking at the e-commerce funnels and comparing that to the debt collection funnels. When you're collecting debt, you're still selling that consumer on paying you versus the other 4 to 5 people that they owe money to.
Correct.
And so that sales funnel and the idea of an e-commerce funnel versus a debt collection funnel, I think ties together quite nicely. And as you start looking at that data and where are people dropping out and why, how is that going to impact the messaging that we're sending, the subjects on the emails that are outbounding, the language that we're using in text messages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's similar to the way that we've tweaked scripts through the years, but now based on behavioral information, you can continue to tweak that content going forward. Now, using artificial intelligence to determine which of these preformed messages that my lawyer has already approved is the best message for that consumer is one use of AI. having generative or agentic AI actually draft that on the fly and send it out without a human checkpoint is a very different animal. And that's where I really want to start looking as an industry at what makes sense and what doesn't make sense for us as a highly regulated industry.
Yeah, no,
Any
that
thoughts,
makes
or
sense.
like, have you seen anything like that in the wild, where people are actually like sending the emails? I mean, some of this generative AI voice tool sets is responding to those consumers. I don't know that that's fully scripted, whereas selecting the appropriate preformed message seems like a much safer bet, but it feels like we need to crawl before we walk.
I would most definitely agree that crawling before walking is going to reduce the amount of pain. If it's not if some people fall, it's when.
Mhm.
Because in the rollout of these type of tools and where they want to implement it, one vendor, one implementation versus another, it's changing so rapidly that it's not like anything else we've had in the past, right? Everything up until now has been, yes, there've been leaps in technology, but it's been along a curve. The increase of the capacity of nanoprocessors, of like how many operations per second they can have, like it doubles every 6 months, whatever it would, and that has to do with the refinement of manufacturing processes, and it's something that you can be defined. The advent of cellular communication technology, right? Years ago, back in the 80s, it was, you had to have a brick. It was a brick phone, right? It was a thing that weighed probably 10 pounds. Yeah, it was huge. There's a battery pack that was literally like 15 times the size of the handset that was that part of it. And that was, that's because now we have, the flip phones, whatever. And it's like, that technology has just, has increased in complexity, but it's along the same lines, like it's predictable. Like no one's going to think that that their cell phone is going to start, you know,
Text
is going to start
messaging became
spying on.
ubiquitous in 2007, right? The launch of the iPhone, the beginning of Android shortly thereafter, really started text messaging. Well, it's 2025 and I'm still talking to debt collection groups about implementing text messaging. So let's not pretend that we're a fast moving industry because we're so heavily regulated. The
That's
fear that
exactly
I
right.
see now is if the technology is moving so fast, we have never really kept up with technology in that realm previously because of the regulations associated with our space. What kind of threat level does that create for us when we start running so fast that we trip and fall? And over the last couple of years, we look at quite a few different, very reputable, well known organizations across the space that are not here anymore because of data breaches. Are we then going to see a wave of AI related incidences, whether that be the cause of a data breach or litigation or issues or class actions that are specifically related to the use of artificial intelligence?
I think there's a substantial risk of that, and it goes back to those malicious packets that are out there in your supply chain. You implement more and more complex systems that you rely upon vendors, and the fourth party vendor who's supplying a component that's being integrated into your product. Yes, it's all open source. You get but therein lies the vulnerability. And guess what? The people who are the criminals who are looking to siphon all that data, they are going to each and every system out there, and they're looking for a vulnerability to exploit. And here's the thing: the debt collectors, this particular industry, the core data that drives this business is the exact data that the identity thieves and people want to sell information, they want to get their hands on.
Mm-hmm.
And if they have more trouble getting it from the banks, right? If they can't get it from banks or the credit bureaus, guess who they're going to look at next? If they're not already looking, they're going to come tiptoeing into the systems, trying to find ways into. And the fact that we start having consolidation of vendors or certain supply chain of like, oh, well, everybody's using one of three systems for interact with consumers, and that uses some sort of open source or product that now there's someone happens to install the wrong packet. It's like, okay, all the accounts that pass through that agency, right, are now exposed. They're all being exported behind the backgrounds. You don't know. And if you don't have any sort of policy procedure to sort of check your network traffic, right,
Mm-hmm.
you don't know. That's how, back in the Experian, that's how they figured out there's a data breach, is that they had a network analysis done, and they just, again,
I saw packets leaving that shouldn't be leaving.
exactly, like, wait, that's some network traffic that we're not expecting here. Like, where's this going? And I'm like, oh, okay, that's a problem.
Extraction of large portions of data is one of those big issues, and the debt collection industry is quite literally a honeypot.
It's the growing area of data privacy and control of data that I think you're right that there aren't a lot of guidelines for how is that going to play out and how to prepare yourself for those risks, because you have different states coming up with different data privacy regulations and regarding if there's a breach, or for that matter, how do you know? And one of these data breaches, that could end a company, meaning like just the notice provisions that are imposed upon a data breach from, not only from the federal standpoint, but on the states where you have. So if you're collecting in multiple states, each one of those states is probably going to have its own data breach notification protocol of like, what are you supposed to do? Now, practical advice for people listening to this is there really is genuine value in cyber insurance for data breaches. And there's no reason why you have to reinvent the wheel to try to figure this stuff out before. If you have a data breach, that's what that insurance is for. And they have people who have all that sort of the systems in place to be able to take care of that. It's my small firm. We one of the guys who joined us in our Houston office, he came from one of those large firms that does the data breach stuff. So he has a data breach practice and handles litigation. But the best advice we give clients is like, hey, if you have a data breach, go with your policy. Your policy, they're going to have the panel counsel. They're going to have all this stuff in place so they can do the notifications. They can notify. It's going to be effective. But once that's done, you don't have to continue to pay the $1,000 hour for that. For those particular panel firms to deal with any subsequent litigation. You can go choose your lawyer of choice who knows something about data breaches, and that's sort of like the aha moment for some people. Like, oh, you get the benefit of this policy, but they're not locked into just one of 5 firms who handle quote unquote data breaches, because there can be some big money cases there.
Sounds like a very expensive endeavor, and probably the reason that we've seen some organizations shut down through that process. Now, as we look at the artificial intelligence, I think that there's some really interesting risks here. You bring up a lot of really good points about the state level patchwork and what that ultimately is going to mean, because just like we're dealing with statute of limitations in different states and jurisdictions, and I think you're going to start seeing even some of these cities that like to just randomly pass things start to get involved as well. And how do you start creating segregation between those data sets? We've already had those challenges across the debt collection industry for years now about dealing with CCPA, and then you've got other requirements in Virginia, you've got other requirements in New York, and just trying to deal with that patchwork. I don't see it getting any easier, but maybe someone will build an AI tool that'll help our industry actually manage that process. Who knows? But Nabil, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing your insights with me.
Well, thanks for having me, Adam. You always put together good content, so happy to be part of it.
Well, I greatly appreciate that. For those of you that are watching, if you have additional questions you'd like to ask Nabil or myself, you can leave those in the comments on LinkedIn and YouTube, and we'll be responding to those. Or if you have additional topics you'd like to see us discuss, you can leave those in the comments below as well. And hopefully I'll be able to get Nabil to come back at least one more time to help me continue to create great content for a great industry. But until next time, Nabil, really thank you so much for all of your insights today. This was a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Adam, and keep on doing the good work you're doing, and also congratulations again on your recent baby. So
thank you so much. I appreciate it. And thank you everybody for watching. We'll see y'all again soon. Bye everybody.
Bye for now.